The diner smelled like burnt coffee and rain-soaked boots. Ethan Reynolds sat in his usual booth by the window, his 6-year-old daughter Emma coloring quietly beside him. It was just another Tuesday night in their quiet little town, until he noticed her. The waitress. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with dark circles under her eyes and a polite smile she wore like armor. She refilled his coffee without meeting his gaze, but it wasn't her tiredness that caught his attention. It was the man at the corner table. Ethan had seen his kind before. Loud, laughing just a little too hard at his own comments, leaning toward her every time she passed by, his hand accidentally brushing hers as she set down his plate. At first, Ethan tried to ignore it. He'd learned to mind his business since his divorce. After all, he was just a single dad trying to raise his little girl right. But then he noticed the signs. First, the way her hand shook as she refilled the man's drink. Second, how she flinched every time he called her sweetheart, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Third, how she forced a smile but couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. Fourth, how the man leaned closer, whispering something that made her stiffen and bite her lip. And finally, the small tear that slipped down her cheek as she turned away. That was it. Ethan couldn't stay silent. He looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep with her head on his arm, her little fist still clutching a crayon. He thought about the kind of man he wanted her to believe her father was. So he slid out of the booth and walked to the counter. "Excuse me," he said softly to the waitress when she returned with a pot of coffee. "Is he bothering you?" She blinked, startled, and at first she shook her head. But when their eyes met, she faltered. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Yes." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. He turned, walked straight to the man's table, and planted his hands on the edge. "That's enough," he said, his voice calm but steady. The man laughed. "Mind your own business, buddy." But Ethan didn't budge. She said no. "And you're done here." Something in his tone must have gotten through, because the man's smirk faded. People in the diner had gone quiet now, watching. The waitress stood behind Ethan, her hands trembling. "You don't scare me," the man muttered, but he grabbed his coat and left anyway, the bell over the door jingling as it closed behind him. Ethan turned back to the waitress, who was wiping her eyes and trying to smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Nobody should ever make you feel small." He returned to his booth, and when Emma stirred awake, she asked sleepily, "Daddy, why were you talking to that man?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because," he said, brushing her hair from her eyes, "sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. But it's always worth it." The waitress came by one last time before they left, slipping a note onto the table. Ethan didn't read it until he got home. "You reminded me tonight that there are still good men in this world. Thank you for not letting me feel invisible." Ethan folded the note and tucked it into his wallet, next to a picture of Emma. That night, he told his daughter a story before bed, about kindness, about courage, and about standing up when it counts. She fell asleep smiling. And somewhere in that quiet little town, so did the waitress. Because sometimes, a stranger's voice is all it takes to make someone feel seen. And sometimes, choosing kindness can change more than one life.